This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, college football writer with the Associated Press. We are going to get back to our regular routine this week, which means a guest and a conversation as opposed to just me talking. And we're going to stick to football, mostly because there are plenty of good places to get the information you need about the coronavirus outbreak. In fact, the plan is for me to be part of one of those ways starting next week. The AP is planning to launch a daily podcast tapping into its reporters all over the world to cover the coronavirus pandemic, and the plan is for me to host Inside the Outbreak, which will be about a 10 or 15-minute podcast every day to look at all aspects of the news related to dealing with the virus. You'll be able to find that next week in all the places you find this podcast. So we'll keep this podcast as a place where you can mostly forget about the virus. Though I will warn you that with the pandemic disrupting just about everything in our lives, we will be covering the ways college sports recovers and moves forward from an unprecedented interruption. This week, though, it's all football. My guest is Bill Connelly of ESPN, the brains behind the SP Plus projection system. Bill has been on this show before. He is one of my favorites. Back in February, he released his preseason SP Plus rankings. We'll dive into them and compare them to the way too early human rankings. We'll look for teams that might be in line for regression this year and others where the numbers suggest a big bounce back. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcasts, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. Please subscribe, and if so inclined, give us a good review. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Joining me this week on the podcast is Bill Connelly from ESPN. He is the brains behind SP Plus rankings. Bill, good to talk to you. Hope social distancing is treating you well.
Had lots of practice up through the years, so this is old hat right here. It's in my wheelhouse.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you and your family are doing well and are safe and healthy. But let's talk some football. So in February, you came out with your preseason rankings for the upcoming season. First of all, just again to set the stage, though I have a feeling you're a recurring guest on this podcast, and I do always assume that a fair amount of my listeners probably consume your stuff. But just give us an idea of what goes into the preseason SP Plus rankings.
So it's basically three factors. I tried to keep it as simple as possible. Granted, I've gotten super complicated within that simplicity, I guess. But there are basically three factors that go into the preseason projections. First one is recent history, which makes sense. Just program health, and the best predictor of winning is that you just won. I mean, those are pretty easy things, especially for college football. The second piece is returning production, and that's something I've tried to stay ahead of the curve, I guess you could say, in recent years, trying to move past using returning starters and look at how much production from each unit you're getting back and which ones carry the most weight in terms of year-to-year improvement and regression. What I found over those last few years is that basically the quarterback position, which of course, but then the receiver, the receiving core and the secondary, the defensive secondary they have much more of an impact on year-to-year improvement or regression based on what you return there, how much of your production you return. So the continuity is very big there, and so that carries a decent amount of weight, that returning production figure. And then the last piece is just recruiting. It's not a huge factor, but it's basically, okay, well, here's how much production you're losing. Now, what kind of caliber athlete are you replacing those guys with? And so that kind of fills in the rest of the gap. So recent history, recent recruiting, and returning production.
Pretty simple stuff. And at the number one spot then on your rankings is Alabama, followed by Ohio State, Clemson, Georgia, Penn State at number 5. I'll say usually I would stop at 5, but I'll say LSU at number 6 because they are the defending national champions, and people are probably wondering where LSU is. And you can find Bill's stuff online at ESPN.com. So, I guess a little bit, maybe a tad, tiny little bit of a surprise that Alabama would be number 1 because they're coming off a 10-2 season, and there's sort of a narrative that maybe they're a little vulnerable. How about vulnerable? Let's use that word. So were you at all surprised when you started mixing and matching your numbers that it was Alabama number 1 and not maybe Ohio State or Clemson?
Yeah, I expected it to be Ohio State 1, Clemson 2. I did not expect Alabama to get the third. I expected them to get the third spot. I expected them to be very high. But what ended up actually helping them, as strange as this sounds, Tua's injury, as much as it kind of seemed to end their season in real time, at least when he went down against Mississippi State last year, that gave them an opportunity to return more of their quarterback production from last year because Mac Jones got an extended audition. And not only did he get an extended audition, but he looked really good. That's kind of the thing I found myself saying a lot in the offseason here. He had a better passer rating than Joe Burrow against Auburn, and he had a better passer rating against Michigan than Justin Fields. So, I know a lot of Alabama fans. I know a lot of people were assuming, if spring football existed this year, that Bryce Young would have a very good shot at overtaking him to be the starter next year. And maybe so if he's that good, but he would have to be pretty good because Mac Jones set a pretty high bar. So basically, you don't lose your entire quarterback production. You get back 2 of your top 4 receivers. Obviously, Waddle was going to come back, but Devontae Smith coming back was a nice boost, especially with what I was just talking about with receiver and core continuity. You get Najee Harris back, most of your offensive line. Not only does a good portion of your front 7 return, but then a couple of pieces that you thought you were going to have this year who got hurt, they're back as well. And so that production piece, they ended up having a better overall returning production percentage than Clemson, than Ohio State, than LSU, or anybody else of those top teams. That ended up making the difference.
So let me jump to LSU for a second, because at number 6, that's still pretty good. Obviously, there's a fair amount of production coming back. At the receiver spot, you lost a fair amount. With Jamar Chase alone brings a lot of production back. Yeah. But obviously, you're also losing all that Burrow stuff, and you're losing. I mean, they lost a ton. In some ways, I was almost surprised that they came in 6th. That's how much they lost. So was there anything, again, 6 is not a bad place to be. That's about where they probably started last year, I'm guessing, and they won the national championship. Yep. The big question will be, can Miles Brennan do anything to replicate Burrow? Obviously, there's a whole bunch of other questions that having to do with coordinators and things like that. But number 1, it starts with, what can Miles Brennan do to bring even remotely the same production as Joe Burrow? When you ran the numbers and LSU was 6th, was that surprising at all that they were that high?
Yeah, I mean, they did post a pretty high number by the end of last year, especially offensively. So even if they were to come down off of that, it was going to hold them up a decent amount. And the fact that Miles Brennan got quite a few snaps as the backup last year helped. But then also, getting Jamar Chase and Terrace Marshall back, that's 2 guys who combined for like 2,400 receiving yards. That kept the bottom from falling out offensively. And I mean, the offensive line gets turnover there. It certainly drags them down a little bit, but overall, the offense is still projected to produce solid numbers. It really is like I have just as many questions now as I did last year. I think when losing not only Burrow but Brady as well. I think there's a lot to prove there, and we'll see what they do defensively. They benefit from the fact that I think the smallest weight, the linebacking core and turnover at linebacker carries the smallest weight in the returning production formula. They lose quite a few linebackers, but theoretically, good linebackers are easier, or linebacker production is easier to replace than other things. And getting back most of the secondary is going to help. Delpit obviously is gone, but Stingley, Vincent, Stevens, all those guys are back, and that should help a lot. So, yeah, like this isn't a situation where the bottom's going to fall out, but I do think, when you compare them to the top 5 teams, or at least the top 4 for sure, they do have a lot more questions to answer now heading into this year.
Right, because SP Plus, it can't wait coaching turnover, right, to a certain degree.
Right.
So that'll be in some ways.
I want to try in that regard, but I've never found anything that works when it comes to incorporating coaching turnover.
Yeah, I think that's the most. Listen, I think LSU has a chance to be maybe the most fascinating team in the country this year because of the fact that it had a historically great season last year, and so much of the reason why it was historically great is now gone. So the how far will they fall type of conversations, I can't remember. In fact, maybe, you're a good person to ask about this. I can't remember a defending champion that came into a season that was going to come into a season with this many question marks, mostly just the idea of having that quarterback move on, but also both sides of the ball as far as coordinators. And again, you can say, well, there have been other defending champions who have lost quarterbacks, but this quarterback just had maybe the greatest season in the history of college football. And then you throw in the coordinators, and then you throw in all the early entrants to the NFL draft. And as well as LSU recruits, I find myself feeling like this is maybe not a completely unprecedented situation in the history of, and even the recent history of college football, but in the very recent history, I can't seem to find another team that matches this.
Yeah, I think you have to go back to 2010-11, I guess, Auburn. If you think about the non-Alabama Clemson champions that we've had recently, Florida State was extremely young when they won in 2013, and we expected them to roll in 2014. And then when Ohio State won in 2014, they were easily number one headed into 2015 and lost the one game they couldn't lose. So, yeah, I think the answer has to be basically you have to go back almost a full decade to another team in the SEC West to find one losing this much in an offseason. And then they're still sixth. They're still going to be basically one upset from returning to the SEC title game. So life's pretty good.
So let's look around the SP Plus rankings to find some teams that the humans seem to be a little more excited about than maybe the numbers are, or maybe vice versa. So I was looking at not just ESPN's Way Too Early, which I think mostly Mark Schleybaugh, that's his fingerprints on that. And I looked at Stuart Mandel's from The Athletic, and I looked at Paul Meyerberg's from USA Today. And honestly, generally speaking, the humans and the numbers don't vary that much. Right?
Yep.
Which is one of the cool things I noticed throughout the years when I'm in doing the AP poll, that generally speaking, there's maybe a few outliers here and there, but especially toward the very top of the rankings, the order may be slightly different, but most of the teams are about the same.
That's something I definitely noticed, especially these last few years. And part of it's probably because it's really hard it's really easy to pick the top teams. And at some point we stop paying attention after the top 3, 4, 5 or whatever. It's, that list doesn't actually change much. But no, it is really interesting because basically we get to kind of focus our conversation on 2 or 3 teams, and there are usually basically 2 or 3 standouts. Otherwise, it's pretty much in agreement.
A couple of teams that I'm noticing that S&P does not love nearly as much as human beings right now. There's a fair amount of love for Iowa in the way too early part of the season. I think there's a lot of folks who are glancing into their crystal balls and thinking, boy, Iowa could be maybe borderline top 10, maybe top 15. I mean, just to give you a little example here, Paul Meyerberg from USA Today has Iowa at, and I probably should have been better prepared for this, has Iowa at, where do you have that ball? Maybe he doesn't have them as high as they thought he did. So, okay, well, I know Stuart Mandel was pretty high on Iowa, and he's got them at number 13. Mark Schleybaugh has Iowa also somewhere in the top 25 here. Anyway, okay, so I kind of blew that one. So, but most of the Schleybaugh has him at number 23. Stewart has him inside the top 20. SP Plus has Iowa at 29. So again, not a huge divergence, but enough that, again, there's going to be some hype, some human hype about Iowa going into the season. I think they're probably a lock to be in the top 25, and I think there'll probably be at least some momentum despite the change at quarterback because they have a lot of other pieces coming back at skill position to sort of edge them into the top 20, maybe even top 15 discussion. That looks to me like Iowa is, be a little bearish on Iowa or maybe try to sell Iowa if I'm buying and selling.
Right. Yeah. I mean, basically, yeah, it's close. But, I think basically what you need to know about Iowa from an SP Plus perspective is last year they were 6th on defense and 54th on offense. The offense just really wasn't what it was supposed to be. I thought it had a little bit more of a ceiling than what they ended up showing. And, I mean, they had their moments, obviously, when they could run the ball at will on an opponent like, say, USC, then it looked really good. But when they had to pass, when the run wasn't working and they were behind schedule, they were pretty mediocre. The receiving core, I kind of expected big things from, and it didn't happen. So that was where the disappointment was, and now they have a new quarterback. And, maybe, Petrus or whoever is going to be better than Nate Stanley was. I have no idea, but that was the problem they had. And then on defense, they lose a couple of key pieces in the secondary, 3 out of 4 on the defensive line, I think. And so basically, while the defense is still going to be good, it's not going to be as good. And if the offense falls at all with a new quarterback, then, yeah, that kind of drags you out of the top 25. I think for me, like, their state mate, Iowa State, is another one that I think people might try to talk themselves into. Especially with all the close losses last year.
I will guarantee you I will talk myself into Iowa State. I've done it the last couple of years. I'm kind of a Matt Campbell fanboy, so I will be that person. Talk me out of Iowa State before I go down that road.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot to like when you just, number one, they were basically Baylor, but they lost the close games that Baylor won. They lost by 1 to Iowa. They lost by 2 to Baylor. Touchdown to Oklahoma State. 1 point, of course, to OU. Like, they were really close. They were 24th in SP Plus last year. And so they were close to that breakthrough. Now they have Purdy back and Breece Hall. The problem for me is that they were defensive driven last year. Even last year with Purdy, they were much better on defense than offense. And their defense now does have some stuff to replace, especially up front. The defensive line gets dramatically thinned out. I'm looking at, 8 defensive linemen last year who logged at least 140 snaps, and half of them are gone. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be really tricky. Losing Marcel Spears is going to be really tricky. And this doesn't go into the numbers, but I'm curious about Iowa State from the innovation perspective, because they are one of the most innovative defenses when it comes to coming up with creative ways to stop spread offenses. And when it works, it really, really works. And I think a lot of people are starting to imitate them. But you end up with some sort of innovator's curse kind of thing where once everybody starts imitating what you do stops being innovative and different, and it's easier to prepare for. So I think that's going to be really tricky. I think their margin for error is not very big, even if they could. You look at their schedule, you don't see a lot of automatic losses there. So they could be, but I think it's going to be pretty risky.
I'm glad you said that about Iowa State, because that was my stance for most of the year, that if you took Iowa State, Baylor, and TCU and just shuffled the injury luck and close games, they were not really, all three of them were not all that much different, which I think is a good, and there's probably a 5,000 word think piece there on the margins of having an all-time great season and being a disappointment, and how slim those margins are through a lot of college football. So
TCU was 1-6, I think, in one possession games. Iowa State lost 5 one-possession games. And then Baylor won 7 or something one possession games. It really did. It does take skill to make those plays at the right time, but that is such a randomness factor for Baylor. And when you factor in all the other turnover that they're going to be dealing with in 2020, they're the other team. They might get a courtesy top 25 ranking because of how well they did last year. I think they're barely top 40, I think, in SP Plus this year. They're on the 33rd.
Yeah,
so it could be worse. But they are a pretty big candidate to fall, both because of turnover and because they're not going to win every close game again. Or every close game that wasn't against OU.
So just to tighten up that loop there with Iowa, I missed in the USA Today way too early. Iowa is 10th So 10th for USA Today, 13th for The Athletic and Stuart Mandel, and 23rd on ESPN, which is all a lot higher, or at least higher than 29 and SP+. So Iowa, definitely one of those teams. And Iowa State, too, is showing up in some of the preseason way too earlys, but number 30 on SP+. I'm going to basically jump off of what you just said with Baylor, because Baylor is another one that, again, just loses a ton. And I think, I think Stewart was one of the few, Stuart Mandel from The Athletic didn't have Baylor. The other issue with Baylor is at the time, and this is, again, something that doesn't go into SP+, but at the time a lot of the way too earlys came out, we weren't sure if Matt Rule was going to be the coach there or not.
Right.
I have a feeling when the AP Top 25 comes out in August, God willing, with everything that's going on, I think Baylor will miss the cut because of turnover on the field, close games from last year, and also the turnover in coaching staff. There's a team right behind Baylor, which I think is a really good example of human beings will think one way, SP Plus thinks another way. Cincinnati at number 34. So Cincinnati had a terrific season last year. They managed to keep Luke Fickell as their coach, a big win. I think that, and a lot of, again, in the human polls, you're going to find Cincinnati right in the middle of the top 25. A lot of 15s and things along those lines. A lot of being rated as the best group of 5 team. Mm-hmm. But at number 34 on SP Plus, what is SP Plus seeing as far as loss of production and things along those lines that's maybe holding Cincinnati back? And again, we say this all the time on the podcast. SP Plus is a starting point. Even the brains behind it, Bill Connelly, will sometimes disagree a little bit with it. So when you look at what SP Plus pumps out on Cincinnati with what your own opinion of what might go on with Cincinnati, what's the disconnect?
Well, I think part of it is just that any team that doesn't recruit at a top 20 or 30 level does get dragged down a little bit in the projections because recruiting doesn't play a huge role, but it does play a role. And so, if you lose any production from last year, you're going to get dragged down a little bit because of the recruiting. I mean, he's basically recruiting like a P5 team, but it's still not, top 20, 30. So it is hard for those schools to kind of maintain that high level in these rankings, just by nature, basically. But they're getting dragged down by kind of what I would call an artificial factor too, and that's the fact that Desmond Ridder, the offense completely fell apart when he was battling injury. Ben Bryant had a few good moments against Memphis, but for the most part, number one, Ridder's full season numbers throwing the ball weren't all that great, and part of that was because of how badly he performed when he was injured, and then he was out and missed the Memphis game, and Bryant tried his best. So if you just think of Cincinnati with a healthy Desmond Ridder, they're probably projected a little higher than, I think 57th offensively. Maybe they're more like top 50 or closer to top 40 if Ridder's full strength, and that alone kind of gets them towards the top 30. I like Cincinnati a lot. I think the defense is going to be absolutely dynamite. It's projected 28th, and I could easily see it getting up into the top 20. I love that. The combination, the coaching they've got there, and I think Cincinnati is a prime candidate for top 25 or 30 performance. I don't think it's going to be top 10, but yeah, I think they're getting dragged down by a couple of factors that are out of their control and things that they could overcome this year.
Yeah, and another thing to understand that, so SP Plus does not project wins. Well, it projects a win total, but it's not doing it in the way a human being would, right? So in other words, or maybe is it sort of going win this game, lose this game? In other words, based on its schedule?
No. What I'll do here as I go along with my previews the rest of the way, I'm trying to do one a day on Twitter, just counting from 130 up, and what it'll produce when I type in Cincinnati's schedule is it's going to say you've got a 68% chance of winning this game,
sure, and
a 48% chance of winning this game, and so on. And I just pulled up Cincinnati's schedule here. They have a let's see, their average projected win total is 8.3, which would be a little lower than expected, but it does include games at UCF, which is top 20, at Nebraska, which is top 30, plus Memphis at home. So it is a pretty tricky schedule as a whole. but it is looking at odds. It's basically saying on average you'd win 8.3. It's giving them, I think, a 50% chance of winning 9 or more, 20-something% chance of winning 10 or more. So it's definitely, the odds are there. It's just, can they keep Desmond Ridder healthy? Can they continue to play at a really high level defensively? There's still a range of outcomes, even if we look at the schedule and go, oh, they can beat Nebraska, they can beat so-and-so. There are still odds associated with those that make those picks different.
Yeah, and again, just to clean up the mess there that I started at the beginning. So Cincinnati, from the three human polls that we were looking at, USA Today, The Athletic, and ESPN, 16, 17, 18 in those polls. And SP Plus has them in the 30s. And again, some of that, as you said, the recruiting rankings will always hold down the G5 teams a little bit in the preseason rankings. So there's that. And I think also human pollsters probably do a little more of the, I can project ahead on their schedule and I could see them winning 10 or 11 games here.
Right.
And not necessarily in the most scientific manner, but I think I see a little of that too. And again, like humans, when they rank teams, often think of like, well, it will be a reward at the end, where SP Plus is trying to sort of project their performance, and humans tend to try to project a record.
Their record.
Yeah. Which there's a difference between those two things.
Yeah. The other thing that Cincinnati has going against it right now is that we kind of have written off UCF to a certain degree.
Yeah. Let's talk about them for a second here.
Yeah.
UCF was a lot better. UCF was a lot better last year than I think a lot of people want to give them credit for. We kind of forgot that.
Yeah, they were 14th. They were 14th in SP Plus. They're basically exactly the same as they'd been a couple of years before. The only difference was they lost a couple of the close games that they had been winning. Like, it was just kind of a regression to the mean in terms of close game finish. They lost by 1 to Pittsburgh, 3 at Cincinnati, and then the weird upset loss at Tulsa by 3. Otherwise, they were every bit as dominant as always, and that was with a freshman quarterback. I don't know what's happening with Mackenzie Milton. I don't think anybody does just yet. But Dylan Gabriel nearly matched his production last year as a true freshman who wasn't even supposed to be the starter to start the year. They have Otis Anderson back. They have Greg McCrae back and Trey Nixon. Almost all of their defense is senior and junior heavy. Like, this is a dynamite squad that UCF's got. But they lost those close games last year, and Cincinnati kind of stole some headlines. Therefore, they're starting ahead of the pack when they really probably shouldn't.
Okay, I want to take a quick break, and then I want to come back with a little regression to the mean or bounce-back candidate, because I think the numbers have a couple of teams that some of our old favorites that we love to talk about, a little more optimistic this year than they had them last year when maybe more was expected of them. You're listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm talking with Bill Connelly from ESPN, the brains behind SP Plus. We'll be back right after this.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
And we're back on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. Ralph Russo talking with Bill Connelly from ESPN about SP Plus and its projections for next season. Let's start with Texas, shall we? Because last year, all the human beings were really excited about Texas because they had been so good in 2018. And they were at most, borderline top 10, at worst, if not in most people's top 10s to start the season. But SP Plus was waving a finger and saying, don't be too confident, and which led to a lot of Texas fans really disliking Bill Connelly. So fast forward, Texas was a bit of a disappointment last year. I, being a big fan of your work, had tried to caution a lot of folks that, hey, Texas might be due for a little regression here, and that's exactly what happened, but maybe even a little more so than I even would have thought. So now, again, let's fast forward again. Suddenly now, after last year, the expectations are a little tamped down on Texas, generally speaking, in the human polls, though I think they're still popping in there in that 15 to 25 range. SP Plus, though, is suddenly a Texas fan. SP Plus has
That's
Texas at number 14 going into next season. So please explain, Bill, why all of a sudden you're now a horns up kind of guy, as opposed to last year when you were totally a horns down guy.
Well, never forget that the stats and the people who create them are probably by nature antisocial, and they are built to frustrate. No, the thing about Texas heading into last year was that they won we were just talking about close games and whatnot. They won a ton of close games in 2018, and for every great performance they produced as an underdog or near underdog, which is kind of a Tom Herman specialty, which we saw last year, because looking back now, losing by 7 to Oklahoma and by 7 to LSU, pretty good result. They still have this weird kind of inconsistency when it comes to producing that level of effort against teams that are lesser ranked. And it bit them a little bit last year. You know, they barely beat Kansas State. They lost to TCU by 10. But it was still – simply winning a bunch of close games doesn't necessarily mean you're guaranteed to do it again, and so that bit Texas pretty hard. The thing that also bit Texas pretty hard, and one of the reasons they were projected to so low was that I was talking about how turnover in the secondary can be really costly to your defensive ratings. Well, they had massive turnover in the secondary, and then all the guys they had last year got hurt at one point or another, and so what ended up happening from a numbers perspective is, the offense actually overachieved a good amount. Like Devin Duvernay stepped up. Eagles gave them a deep threat. The running back core was okay, but in the end, they didn't require Sam Ehlinger to run 38 times a game to move the chains. The passing game really kind of caught on, and they finished 10th in offensive SP+, which was higher than expected. The defense was worse than expected, however, because of those injuries in the secondary and how bad that secondary was for a good portion of the year. They finished 68th on that side of the ball. So I think they were projected 30th or 31st heading into the year. They finished 26th because the offense really was good and special teams was good. But they now have all the continuity on defense that they didn't have last year. Who knows about the coordinator change, obviously, but they lose Malcolm Roach and Brandon Jones, the safety, Brandon Jones, and that's pretty much it. All those guys who got hurt in the secondary and all those guys who got experience because of the injuries, they're all back in the secondary. The linebacking core is mostly intact, and now you can kind of see, that Ash will have something to work with on defense. They still have Ehlinger on offense. They do lose Duvernay and Colin Johnson, but they get Eagles and Malcolm Epps back, and you can kind of see a good team taking shape there, a top 15 level team, especially when you incorporate the new recruiting rankings. So it was funny. I laughed out loud when I saw that now my numbers like Texas now that everybody's jumped off the bandwagon, but I can at least explain it.
So right behind Texas is at number 15 USC. Well, again, one of our favorites, right? Because there's the chorus of non-USC fans will always say USC's overrated every year. Boy, why do the polls love USC? This year, again, I think you're going to see USC, especially with Slovis back. They have a ton of players back, especially on the offensive side. Actually, They got a fair amount of players coming back and production coming back on the defensive side. So a similar situation, I think, with Texas in that the defense didn't play well last year, but by simply bringing a fair amount of it back, the continuity. Now, again, you never know what's going to happen with a new defensive coordinator and some new defensive coaches. The hope if you're a USC fan is that makes guys better. But usually on the defensive side of the ball, just a lot more experience, a little better health, you could take a step forward there. So USC, while a lot of us will be going, well, USC, I wonder what they're going to do this year, SP Plus kind of likes USC at number 15.
Yeah, normally USC gets propped up by recruiting rankings, and that which leads to people rolling their eyes. But we know that's not a factor here this year with the recruiting class and the rankings they produced last year. What's propping them up this year, what's pushing them in towards a top 15 level, number one, the offense was ninth. This really was like Texas. They were ninth offensively and 60th defensively with a bunch of young and injured guys defensively. They were kind of the same team, except USC was led by a freshman quarterback, which was pretty incredible. And at one point had to play a couple. Their starter gets hurt immediately. Slovis comes in but gets hurt. Matt Fink upsets or helps to upset Utah and all that. Like, it was a big mess at quarterback, but they still ended up ninth. They lose Michael Pittman, but they get back Tyler Vaughns, which surprised me a little bit. They get back Amon-Ra St. Brown. They get back Drake London. It's going to be a really, really good offense. They do lose Austin Jackson, left tackle, but that's pretty much it. And so just things seem to have taken shape really nicely offensively, especially when they held on to Graham Harrell when suddenly a lot of other jobs seem to be trying to pull him away. And defensively, it's like you just said, they were all freshmen and sophomores last year. They were dramatically young on defense last year. And while we don't completely know everything we need to know about the talent levels, they're not young anymore. All those freshmen and sophomores are sophomores and juniors. So they had some of the highest returning production rates of anybody in the country, and that's what allowed them to get projected to improve so much.
So apparently, at least a couple of guys are SP Plus fans because
That's right.
The Athletic has USC right around your ranking. I think it was on number 15. USA Today has at 17. ESPN's way too early from Mark Schlabach, unranked USC. Though, again, to cut Mark a little slack, he might have done that right after the Holiday Bowl. You know,
right, yeah.
Like USC certainly left a bad taste in some folks' mouth at the end of last season. I can also understand just the overall uncertainty of this season and where you're going to have who's going to be coaching where. So when some of these came out, I can definitely see somebody like Schlabach going, you know what, I think I'm just going to stay away from USC for now.
I just pulled up, he put out an updated rankings in February. He has USC 21st, so there you go.
Oh, there you go. Okay, I'm sorry. Actually, yeah, apparently I'm not working off the very latest ones. But so USC is one of those flavors that again often gets talked about as they're always overrated. Yep. They're always overrated. There's a couple of other ones, the programs that we've been waiting for big returns, right? We've been waiting for a big return from a couple of these programs, and some of us thought that we might get something like that. We might get steps forward last year. And instead, we got steps back, or at least, steps sideways at best. And that is Miami and Nebraska. Now, Nebraska started last year with a fair amount of hype for a team that wasn't good the year before and was a top 25 team in most of the human polls, and then went out and flopped again and was an under 500 team. I'm going to sort of lump them together but ask you to talk about them separately. So SP Plus has Nebraska number 25. Now, again, if I remember correctly, SP Plus was a little skeptical about Nebraska coming into last year, so the humans were a little bit ahead of themselves, got a little out over their skis on Nebraska. The other team that we've been waiting for their back from is Miami. Miami comes into this year 23rd in SP+. Now, they're not showing up in any of the way too early human polls. I think all the humans are like, forget that. I've been burned a couple of times with those teams. So Miami at number 23, Nebraska at number 25. Again, the one thing I'll say about Miami is, and trust me, no Miami fan wants to hear about this, I mean, close games and just terrible offense, but pretty good defense. Like, that was a weird team last year that I think at the end of the year seemed to just sort of pack it in, but was probably better than its record was for a lot of the year, and then seemed to give up at the end of the year. Actually, let's start with Miami since my last word was on Miami.
So in one way, Miami finished 33rd in SP+, which seemed high, but when we kind of peel back the onion, it starts to make sense. They were ninth defensively, which, I mean, yes, of course they were. Manny Diaz defenses are almost always good, last couple of years at Texas aside, but they were 81st on offense and 94th on special teams for what that's worth. So, I mean, you kind of see, like, that defense really kind of deserved better than it got. And the offense, when they lost games, they did score 20 and 25 against Florida and North Carolina, which was below average, but not terrible. But they ended the year getting shut out by Louisiana Tech, scoring 17 against Duke, which was not great. They obviously had problems. And but that doesn't really – SP Plus never completely gave up on Miami like it gave up on some other teams last year, primarily because they came up with the most creative ways to lose games. One of the numbers I like following, especially during the year, it's something I call post-game win expectancy. It basically takes all these predictive factors, the things that go into SP Plus, the success rates and turnover bounces and all these other things, and basically says, like, with the stats from this game, that, no recruiting rankings or anything like that. Just with the stats that this game produced, you could have expected to win this game X% of the time. In the short term, it provides us with kind of another way of looking at luck, more or less. Over time, you start to see certain coaches always overachieve or underachieve by a game or so. The Ken Niumatalolos of the world, the Bill Snyders of the world always underachieve or always overachieve by a game. But in the short term, it can tell you when things are just kind of funky. Well, Miami last year had a 71% post-game win expectancy against North Carolina and lost 28-25. 82% against Virginia Tech, and they lost 42-35. 72% against Georgia Tech, and they lost 28-21, and 91% against Florida International, and they lost 30-24. Like they kind of broke SP Plus last year in the ways they came up with to lose games, whether it was bad turnovers here, whether it was missed PATs and horrible special teams there, whether it was FIU basically having like 3 or 4 good drives all game, but finishing with all of them with touchdowns while Miami screwed up in the red zone on offense. They came up with a bunch of creative ways to lose, and in theory, that doesn't continue. Obviously, with Miami, they have this whole fragile thing where when they screw up, they go to the sideline and famous old players are yelling at them on the sideline, and you could see how that might snowball on a team like that. But on paper, this was probably a 9-win team last year. You add up all those post-game win expectancies, you get 8.7 wins on average, and they won 6. And so in theory, that turns around. Now you've got an offensive plan with D'Eriq King, and you can kind of see there how maybe it comes together. You can also see why nobody's going to give them the benefit of the doubt. They're going to have to go out and earn it at this point.
Are D'Eriq King's, last year he didn't play much. I was going to say, are his numbers in your evaluation?
Yeah, what I do with transfers, and I have not come up with a better way to do this, but basically I just smash your production into your new team's denominator, basically. Mm-hmm. And in Miami, in the case of an abbreviated season like that, what I'll tend to do is, or like when a guy gets hurt, I'll go back and use the previous year's stats. So right now, Miami does get credit for D'Eriq King throwing for 3,000 yards and rushing for 870, like he did in 2018.
Okay, so it's 2018. Okay.
Right. So yeah, we can negotiate whether that's the proper way of doing that or not. But either way, their defense is projected to be really good still. Their secondary is experienced, and then their offense is pretty much in a can't get worse situation.
Right. So Miami, Nebraska, maybe again. Okay. So we talked about Miami. Now let's talk about Nebraska, because again, like the humans got out over their skis on Nebraska, and Nebraska, again, the offense was really good last year. Or pretty good last year. It seemed to come together later in the season. The defense was again, not very good at all. Are we finally going to see Scott Frost in a bowl game with Nebraska? But SP Plus is thinking number 25 here. I mean, so there's now some promise for Nebraska now that all the humans are in wait and see mode.
Yeah, they were projected 39th. They were 49th in 2018, and with what they returned, they were projected to improve to 39th last year, which, the fact that they were among the top 10 or 12 in terms of national title odds, I realize Vegas, does those things to get to, for people to make bets and everything, but they're usually pretty accurate as a whole, and that one was just astounding from day one, and it was still that way when the season started. But they were projected 39th, which means they were actually disappointing last year. They did finish 55th. They were still supposed to try to probably eke out 6 wins or so, maybe 7, but they lost a bunch of close games there down the stretch and finished 5-7 and 55th overall. So that wasn't what was expected, even though there was no built-in second-year bump. Like, obviously, Scott Frost kind of screwed himself by being so good in his second year at UCF, and sometimes that's just not possible. But again, you look at what they return now. They were like almost literally everybody's back on offense. First of all, like never mind recruiting or any other piece. Now you've got a junior quarterback, not a true sophomore. You've got your top running back. You've got 3 of your top 4 receiving options. Everybody on the offensive line, I think, unless somebody's transferred over the last couple weeks anyway. And defensively, they're at least more experienced in the back 7 or 8. The defensive line is kind of a major question mark in that it wasn't very good to begin with, and now they lose their top 3 tacklers from last year. So there are obviously question marks, but the offense is supposed to just take a leap forward. They're projected 25th overall because they're now projected 10th on offense. And, if they get like a top 40 production out of their defense, then they could be a very, very solid team. By the way, I think this is why we're seeing Iowa, people propping up Iowa pretty far, is they might be underestimating Nebraska, and they might be actually underestimating Wisconsin because of Jonathan Taylor's loss. They're still going to return a heck of a defense, and they're still going to return, when's the last time they had a problem at running back? They've got a lot of pieces that projected 10th or 9th, at SP+. And if both of those teams are that good, it's going to be hard for Iowa to put together a top 10 caliber season.
Yeah, that butterfly effect is interesting, Bill, because I think a lot of people do. I felt last year a big part of the Nebraska bump going into the season was exactly that. Was I'm looking at all these teams in the West, and I don't think any of them are all that great. Now, remember, that was a world in which Wisconsin was coming off of an 8-win season. So right. Wisconsin was disappointing for the first time in a while, and everybody else sort of looked the same. So I think that elevated Nebraska in a lot of folks' minds because they just simply thought, well, all of these teams look about the same. Nebraska has a bunch of them at home. I will pick Nebraska to win the West. And if you're going to win the West, well, that means you're probably a top 25 team, ergo. Yeah. Of course, all of that fell apart, and Minnesota ended up being tremendous. So I do think you're right. I do think that there probably is a little bit of, again, looking at some of the human polls, I've got a little sense of Wisconsin in that like 10 or lower area. Now, SP Plus, and then we'll move on to another topic. SP Plus has Wisconsin at number 9, but I do sense that the humans are probably going to be a little more tepid on Wisconsin.
Yeah, I think because he was such a momentous figure, even by Wisconsin running back standards. But again, with the way that returning production gets calculated, running backs and linebackers are theoretically easier to replace. So that's why they get propped up. And I will say, like, of all the things I get wrong, and I get plenty wrong, so I have to pound my chest when I get something right. I remember writing last year in August that I think Minnesota is the team everybody thinks Nebraska is going to be this year because they had the youth movement, because they had everything else, because they looked so good at the end of 2018. So I was really happy that they actually got to prove me right on that one, even if I was wrong about 38 other things.
It's fun to be right, Bill. It's always we're not that often, so it is very fun to be right. So yes, you should gloat. So here's just to give an idea of Wisconsin. So again, number 9 in SP Plus for the 3 human rankings that we've been using. Even though again, I think I'm not using Schlebach's latest. I think I'm using his first. It was 14, and it was 11, and it was 18. So again, SP Plus has Wisconsin higher than all of the humans that we're looking at, and substantially enough that I'm guessing that SP Plus will probably be a little more confident in Wisconsin going into the season than, let's say, the AP poll or the coaches poll going in.
Right.
Okay, I want to hit.
Yeah, and they do lose a lot of offensive linemen.
Yeah,
that is. I forgot about the line, but
but they always seem to have those.
Right, exactly. They're one of the more stable entities in the sport overall.
So I want to hit on some teams that maybe we talked about these teams that might be looking at steps forward. And we touched a little bit on some possible regression teams, especially Baylor. Baylor looks like it's definitely set up for some regression. Who else, when you look at your numbers, sort of screams, could be a step back here this year that maybe, again, the humans are not rating as highly?
I'm curious what people are going to think of Utah, where they should be. I can't decide if they're going to be overrated or underrated at this point, but they were so good last year, until the end anyway, until about the second quarter or so of the Pac-12 title game. They were an incredible team. But they lose so much on defense that they're projected to fall to 45th in defensive SP+, despite the fact that they're good just about every year.
Yeah. And they were top 10 in defense, right, last year in SP+?
Let's see. Where to go? They finished 16th because of the Oregon and Texas game. They were top 10 most of the year.
Okay.
But then the 75 points against Oregon and Texas dropped them a decent amount. So, but no, I mean, they're speaking of stable entities. We know what we're getting from the Utah defense. We get it every year. But when you lose, let's see, 3 of 4 defensive linemen and basically 6 of 7 defensive backs, and I just talked about how turnover there is important, that's going to cost you pretty big. So they're going to have, at best, they're going to have a team that doesn't necessarily start the year in fifth gear, especially when you factor in that they have to replace Tyler Huntley and Zach Moss as well. They get Jake Bentley from South Carolina, so we'll see about him. But there are a lot of key pieces to replace, and I can't decide if they're going to get the benefit of the doubt, kind of like a Baylor might, or whether people are going to understand, wow, that's a lot, and drop them down further in the race. So we'll see.
It also looks like it could be a bit of a rebuild. And I think a lot of people are expecting a bit of a rebuild at Virginia, especially with Bryce Perkins, because he carried so much of that offense. SP Plus has them at 44. And really, to be honest, I don't know if that's going to be that much dramatically different from what they were last year.
They finished 44th last year.
Yeah, so we're going in. So as far as the numbers are concerned, Virginia's just rolling along to what it's been. But I do think, again, like from a perception standpoint, we talked a lot about Virginia last year. They won the ACC Coastal for the first time. So I think the perception might be that Virginia maybe was better last year than they even were. But really what they're heading into this year is about the same as they finished last year.
Yeah, they do. I mean, losing Perkins hurts a lot, but they should be able to offset that defensively. This actually wasn't. It's funny that they won the division with one of Mendenhall's lesser defenses, really, but they returned most of their starting lineup, most of their two deep. So they should be able to improve defensively. Obviously, whether it's Brennan Armstrong or somebody else, they need to find a quarterback, and we'll see, because Perkins was, I think, extremely underrated. Even though people knew him, I think he was still underrated. But that defense should carry some weight.
Okay, I'll give you a couple more of SP Plus believes the hype, SP Plus doesn't believe the hype. SP Plus seems to believe the hype on North Carolina.
Yeah, that surprised me because they didn't really like them all that much last year. They until the end. They finished 30th. They went from 50th in mid-November to 30th at the end of the year because of the way they pummeled NC State and Temple. And they were a little unlucky to lose to Pitt and whatnot. They had all those close games and whatnot. Some were lucky, some weren't. But they improved dramatically over those last three games or so. And then, of course, a returning production formula is going to be friendly for a team that returns pretty much everybody because they were all freshmen and sophomores last year. So I never know how much to react to a small sample. 3 games against Mercer, NC State, and Temple might not be indicative of what happens when they play good teams. But getting Sam Howell back, getting just about every receiver, basically every offensive player back, and only losing a couple of particularly good defenders, it does seem like they're probably pretty well positioned. I still didn't expect them to come in, 17th, I think, but that's how much SP Plus thinks of that offense in particular.
SP Plus does not believe the hype on Cal. Not that Cal is crazy hype, but they're sort of coming in that 20 to 25 range in a lot of people's top 25s. It's like, hey, watch out, which is sort of a watch out for them in the North kind of position, and SP Plus is slotting them in at number 52.
Yeah, technically it is projecting them to improve because they were 74th last year. Right. But the fact is they were 74th last year. They were not only were they sketchy offensively, which I think we all expected, but they fell to 46th defensively, and that's pretty scary when you then think about them losing Evan Weaver. Full stop. I mean, losing Evan Weaver, period, is a big deal because he was so amazing. But they lose most of their line rotation. They lose, 1, 2, 3, 4 of their top 6 defensive backs. They have a lot of retooling to do. And while their offense should get better, yeah, they were lucky to win 8 games last year. That was not a very good football team. I mean, who did their wins come against? Other than Washington, that was a nice win. They barely beat a North Texas team that turned out to not be very good. They barely beat Ole Miss, who wasn't top 50. They barely beat Stanford, who was number 88. They didn't look all that great against UCLA, who was number 79. They just didn't. I mean, most of those wins came against disappointing teams, and it's going to be hard to improve too much beyond that.
Okay, last one for you, or maybe one of the last questions for you. I want you to look between maybe 10 and 15, where you got some interesting teams, Texas A&M, Auburn, Notre Dame, Oregon, and then, of course, our friends Texas and USC. From those 5, who do you think is the most likely to outperform SP Plus?
Outperform? Well, I'm curious about Oregon. They are 13th. They're another team that, the conventional wisdom is a little higher on. because SP Plus only has them at 13th, and that's with a defense that ranks second. That's how little it thinks of Oregon's offense, which was probably a little overrated last year, and then, of course, has to replace Herbert this year. Mm-hmm. If Oregon has a quarterback, if they have somebody they can really lean on moving forward, whether it was Shao was at the backup last
Tyler
year.
Shough,
whether it's him or somebody else, like that's, if they have a quarterback, then maybe they can it did seem like the run game improved a decent amount over the second half of the year. So maybe they're kind of poised to overachieve offensively. So I would say that if they have a nearly top 30 offense or even top 35 or 40 offense, they could be easily a top 10 team and the Pac-12's best national title hope. Right now they're basically right there with USC per the numbers, but I would say they have a decent chance of overachieving. And the problem is that even if they're really good, they still have to play 3 or 4 top 10 teams every year. And, their schedule eases up. You can clearly see a path to 10 wins for them this year, as opposed to last year where it was like, man, top 10 team would go 8-4 with the schedule they had. I would put them as a decent candidate. It's just going to be hard for them to overachieve because 10th is pretty high, and a top 10 team would probably still lose 2 or 3 games to that schedule.
Right, and it's a fascinating year for A&M too, because in year 3 under Jimbo Fisher, right, if they're in that, like if they only are a top 15 team, if they're in that 10 to 15 range. And you're still watching your competitors, Alabama, LSU, maybe even an Auburn, finish in front of you. Aggieland's going to be a very interesting place, right? Because they could perform very much like a top 15 team and still lose 4 games. And again, you're not paying a guy $75 million guaranteed over 10 years to continually go 8-4.
That's Gus Malzahn's curse. I mean,
no doubt.
They have the SEC West in Georgia every year. They usually schedule somebody pretty good in non-conference, and he puts a top 10 to 12 product on the field every year and goes 9-3, maybe. It's a really, really tough job in that division. But you're right. I mean, they're paying $75 million to be a good team that goes 8-4. I don't think that's really what they were counting on.
Bill Connelly, you were great again. A recurring guest to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I really wanted to get into all just sloppy football conversation and projecting ahead, and you were able to deliver big time because we want to get away from some of the stuff that's going on in the real world. I really appreciate you coming on and talk about SP Plus and projecting a little to next season. Great job, man.
Much appreciated. Thanks for having me.
And now 3 and out, first down. As I said at the top of the show, the outbreak is affecting college sports, so we'll cover those stories and pass along the information. So not long before we started taping this podcast, SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey told reporters on a conference call that the chances of getting in any spring football were pretty bleak. Still holding out a sliver of hope, but pretty bleak. The idea of adding additional preseason practices in the summer is already being talked about if things return to normal. I think a good rule of thumb in all this is the people involved have to be proactive in their thinking and preparation. So when we ask them questions, they're going to say, we're talking about this and we're talking about that and we're preparing and we're trying to see a path to doing certain things. But any long-term plan or projection should be thought of as, at best, tentative. Maybe more wishful thinking, in fact. Second down. Last note on that, while we should be absolutely preparing to have college football next season, that starts on time. We should not assume that's the case. And from a fan's perspective, we have plenty else to worry about between now and then. So don't waste your brain space on wondering if the college football season is going to kick off on time. There's more than enough time for that to clear itself up. No need to worry about it now. Third down. A word on the biggest news in the NFL, and that's Tom Brady, who tormented us Jets fans for most of the last 20 years. I have to say I was kind of stunned it played out the way it did, mostly because I didn't see much of a market for a quarterback who would be 43 this season. I figured the Patriots wouldn't have many better options, and neither would Brady, so they would be a match made for each other. That turned out to be very wrong. We'll see how it plays out, but I do think it speaks to why the Patriots have been so good under Coach Bill Belichick. The best organizations remove the emotion from decision-making and the evaluation process. It is especially important in a salary cap sport. It's a little cold-hearted, but it's the stuff that makes championship teams. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Warren Levinson, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts and on Westwood One Podcast, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. Please subscribe so you do not miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.